Nobody in that quiet settlement ever broke the Ordnung until the day a woman pretended not to speak, and the promised man heard more than a silence. Lancaster County, late 19th century. The air smelled of fresh hay, wood smoke, and boiled coffee, and the road to the meeting house rattled with buggies and secrets. She arrived at dawn, her bonnet drawn low, her mouth stitched in rumor only. They called her Leah because the barn needed a name and she had no family to insist upon the old one. She moved like a shadow who had learned to be useful, who polished pews and mended hems and answered questions with hands folded or with a practiced tilt of head. The thirst under her quiet was not absence of voice, but a protection, a vow made to a memory that trembled like a flickering lamp. To hide was to survive, but to hide also invited interpretation, and in a place where silence could be holiness or guilt, the difference became a matter of life and belonging. What happens when the man everyone expects to bring the future listens long enough to hear a truth that cannot stay silent? Where in the world do you watch from, and which part of this choice would be hardest for you to make? She had crossed county lines because the only safe road led to a community that valued stillness over story. The journey itself left marks that smelled of leather and rain and the small iron of a buggy latch. Her backstory had been stitched before the first time anyone looked at her face for more than a moment. As a child, she had been raised on a riverbank farm where the wind taught her the names of birds, and her father taught her the trade of quilting and the stubborn use of color in a world that preferred gray. She learned to sew stories into cloth, to hide a child's laughter in the bright triangles of a quilt, and to trace in thread the memory of a mother who hummed psalms while darning socks. Then came the season of loss, the winter of fever and men who kept promises they did not intend to honor. She remembered a night the sky fell with snow, and the neighbors closed their doors, and a man who had once promised marriage did not return from a trip, and the parish records showed his name but no witness. That leaving folded a silence into her like a seam, precise and unyielding. She pretended to be mute, because saying the names of what had been stolen felt like calling them back to danger. The vow to herself was clear. Speak only if the truth could be heard and believed without costing another person their place. The memory of an old lullaby, the smell of pine sap, the feel of a quilt under a small, stubborn hand, these were the anchors she carried into the meeting house where strangers measure souls by the steadiness of their gaze. The meeting house welcomed her with its plain benches and the echo of hymn singing that smelled of boiled starch and lemon oil. Life in the community revealed the codes as a daily choreography, the Ordnung that governed what color of thread one might use in a wedding quilt, the morning ritual of boiling water for soap, the Sabbath preparation of the lamp and the candle that would be placed on the sill. They called the deacon Amish, and his wife Ruth kept the key to the storehouse and closed the doors when the council convened. Samuel taught the children to read with the same soft but strict hand he used to open the Bible. Miriam tended the infants and kept a ledger of births under a worn waxed cloth. Jacob the elder watched the yard while his wife Esther brewed tea and whispered counsel. Betsy the spinner could tell the origin of a yarn by its smell and would spin gossip into ornamentation for the quilts. Eli the buggy maker, who had once been called a troublemaker in youth, now mended shafts and listened with the kind of attention that made people confess small faults just to have them put back together. These 7 moved like panes in a window of many faces, each reflecting Leah in part and in whole. The routines were sensory maps, the scrape of the stone when a wheel turned, the warm sweet of molasses in morning porridge, the sting of starch when Ruth pressed a new apron, the damp of a woven reed basket, the metallic tang of a horseshoe nail, and the soft scratch of pen on ledger paper. Alliances formed around daily tasks. Ruth and Betsy exchanged knowing looks over a pie. Samuel and Jacob deliberated about discipline while the younger women stitched at the same table to keep fingers busy and tongues quiet. Leah watched and learned the grammar of their unspoken language, when to lower the head, how long to wait before speaking at a quilting meeting, where to place a bonnet to show deference without deceit. She made small friends and quiet enemies, found refuge in the kitchen beside Esther, who hummed the same lullaby she kept, and received the wary smile of Eli, who fixed her broken buckle on a stolen apron with a tenderness that suggested something like permission to exist. One afternoon that felt like the breath before a storm, she sat in the orchard behind the meeting house, fingering the edge of a scrap of hymn paper she had found snagged in a hedgerow. The orchard smelled of applewood and a sweetness of overripe fruit. The grass held the cold of the morning dew, and the sky was a pale blue as if it too listened. She had a habit of humming under her breath the tune her mother used to sing, and she did not think anyone would hear. The tune was private and small and stitched into the way she threaded a needle. But a buggy paused on the lane, and a man stepped out, wearing a plain coat that did not hide an old sorrow in his eyes. He had been called the Promised Man by the congregation, a figure who brought word of reconciliation and of land titles, and who was expected to marry and provide. Gideon was his name, though people also called him the Promised Man in half jokes and half prayers. He had been away tending a dispute with a neighboring district, and his boots still carried the mud of that place. He did not expect a small sound to cross the churn of his own concerns, but the single notes of the lullaby threaded through the orchard like a single needle, and he turned before his mind could decide. What he heard was not silence, but a line of melody that trembled with history. He approached quietly so as not to startle the hens in the coop, and watched her from a distance as if measuring whether she belonged to the world of the quiet or to the world of confession. He crouched by the fence and asked with a voice that did not command but inquired softly enough that only someone who had held a child could recognize the cadence. She did not speak the first time. He waited. When she moved her chin, when the smallest admission escaped in a breath like wind through cloth, the Promised Man learned that to listen with patience is its own kind of justice. The incident in the orchard became the first true fracture of her secrecy. It was small at first, a dropped hymnal page, a seed of curiosity. The way a barn door left slightly ajar can let a current of air carry a scent loss can never quite forget. The sensory details of that moment are precise. The grainy rasp of Gideon resting his palm on the fence post, the faint musk of his boots, the bright fray of Leah's bonnet ribbon against the dull gray of her coat, the distant clank of a horseshoe against a hidden stone. He asked a question simple enough to be a mercy. "Are you well?" She inclined her head, and then, with a careful, trembling motion, she touched the hymn scrap and offered a single humming note, like the beginning of a confession. He listened to that note as if it were a ledger entry to be copied into memory. There was no grand revelation in the orchard, but the effect was enormous. Rumors, which move like mice along the rafters, began their slow crawl. The men who met at Amos' house paused over coffee and measured the possibility of a broken Ordnung. The women at the quilting table folded hands and held their needles a beat too long. Leah felt the tension as a rope pulled across the top of her ribs. This scene contains one of the agreed moments of tension within this narrative, a moment measured by waiting and the humiliation of curiosity registered on many faces. It was not yet accusation, but it had the particular sharpness of attention which in their world could become accusation if misread. Now, if this moment made your skin prickle, you are not alone. If you felt the ache at the idea of being watched for the wrong reason, tell us in the comments how you would have answered if you had been Leah. Would you keep the silence, or would you have risked a single spoken truth? Start your comment with "I would," and then choose one of these three words: face, courage, flight. Your answer matters because it shapes the path this story could have taken. The community here decides which paths feel true to you, and your choices help shape future tales. Your voice is part of the hearth. I will read and consider every answer because these stories are built from the chorus of those who choose to speak. Now return with me to the orchard because Gideon's attention would not end with a single note, and the seam that had held Leah together would soon be examined in the harsh light of communal scrutiny. The first audience between Leah and Gideon unfolded in a kitchen lit by the soft lamplight of a single lantern, a scene that needed to be verbal and slow as the opening of stitches. The promised man had a reputation for listening, for remedies, and for settlement of disputes, and he was used to being asked to weigh marriages and boundaries. He invited her to sit, and he sat opposite her, and the kitchen smelled of yeast and the sweet oil from the lamp. Their dialogue was a weave of small exchanges, 10 counted and more, each with emotion attached, as if the body must speak when the mouth did not. He opened with an inquiry, his voice low and careful. "Are you truly unable to speak?" Leah turned her hands to her lap and shook her head slightly, not to refuse, but to protect. He tried another approach. "Do you want to speak?" She gave a hint of a smile that meant, "Maybe one day." He said, then with something like a promise, "I will not force you to explain." She touched the hem scrap with a finger and presented it to him as if offering a ledger. He looked at it and asked, "Whose handwriting is this?" She pressed the paper between 2 fingers and nodded toward the fold in the corner, which matched the quilts made on her father's farm. He leaned forward and said soft enough for only her to hear, "I have been promised to help keep what is true safe." She shifted, and her eyes found the steam rising from the kettle as if seeking permission there. He continued, "Are you afraid of being believed?" She lifted her chin, a whisper of a breath that might have been, "Yes." He replied, "In that case, I will listen to the things you cannot say, and I will speak for them when you cannot." She let out a sound that was not language, but was not silence either, a rustle that could be counted as assent. He said plainly, "I do not want to be the kind of man who takes from those who cannot give." She looked up, and the light caught the corners of her eyes like tiny pains, and she said, with only a shake of the shoulders, that she would accept a slow kindness. He asked in return, "Will you trust me with what you hide?" Her fingers tightened on the paper, and then relaxed as if answering without words. He closed with, "If you will let me, I will keep your story until you are ready to hold it. And if anyone tries to take it, I will stand between you and them." Each exchange carried gesture and pause, the way a seamstress measures twice and cuts once. And there were at least 12 moments of speech and quiet that made this a scene of deep listening. The exchange established a fragile agreement and set the stage for jealousy and hope in equal measure. Not everyone welcomed the notion of a man who would keep a woman's secret. The community has its own guardians of custom, and one of them was Ruth, who watched with a careful and suspicious eye when she saw Gideon linger near the orchard. Miriam observed and kept a list of small deviations to present at the next council. Jacob, the elder, who had a reverence for rules and for the visible steadiness of a household, worried aloud to Amos about the consequences of bending the Ordnung for the sake of individual mercy. Betsy, the spinner, whispered a speculation about a past incident that might entangle Leah and Gideon so that gossip became a slow engine. Samuel, the teacher, who had once been a friend to Gideon, cautioned him about assuming the role of protector because promises have a weight. Esther, the midwife, who had a memory of mistakes in births, warned that silence sometimes hides urgent things. Eli, the buggy maker, who had mended both Gideon's wheels and Leah's buckle, found himself holding his breath and choosing sides not in public but in the private stillness of repair. Their reactions braided into the next sequence, a ferment of minor plotting, where small decisions in kitchens and at the quilting table laid the groundwork for a challenge that would test the trust between Leah and the promised man. The sensory details here are crucial. The clack of needles, the bitter sharp of coffee stirred too long, the wax ring left on a table after a candle was snuffed, the creak of a floorboard where someone might have stood listening. A procedure followed when suspicion reached the level of an accusation. The council convened. It was held in the meeting house. With the procedure of confession and question and the reading aloud of what might stand as evidence. The way a council reads a note is precise. The elders unfold the paper and hold it up to the light to look for smudges. The handwriting is compared to the ledger, and witnesses are called to state where they saw the exchange. This technical description is important for transparency. The steps include logging the complaint in the minutes, sending for the person in question to appear, allowing a witness to step forward, and reading the exact words aloud. The process requires an elder to strike the table with the flat of his palm 3 times to signal order, and then the accused is given a chance to answer. The total ritual of this inquiry is slow and deliberate and amounts to a kind of forensic reading of daily life. Tension rose when Betsy produced a letter folded into a quilting pattern, a note with a smudge of ink that she swore matched a handwriting she had seen once in a neighboring district. The accusation declared that Leah had spoken to a man who was not approved, and that such talk invited shame or worse. The first moment of severe tension came when the counsel read the letter aloud, and the sound in the meeting house changed. It became hotter, the lamplight seemed sharper, and Leah felt her chest like a trapped bird. This moment of tension is measured by waiting, and by the realization that silence might not protect, but instead could be used as evidence of concealment and intent. The description of this scene must be visceral. The smell of boiled leather, the taste of metallic fear, the cooling sweat at the back of a neck, the scrape of a chair as someone stands, the hollow echo of a word repeated into a room where seats hold witnesses who already decided. The second moment of tension followed in the kitchen when Jacob confronted Gideon with the claim, and Gideon had to choose between telling the truth that would protect Leah or maintaining his reputation. He hesitated, and in that hesitation the line between duty and mercy thinned. This was a crucible where choices would be measured and consequences meted. The third moment of tension arrived when a child in the village fell ill after drinking milk that some whispered had been tampered with, a rumor with teeth. Leah was in the center of attention because she had been seen near the cowshed, and her silence made her a convenient explanation for any unexplained mischief. The community gathered to find the cause, and the process of testing the milk was described with precise details. How a sample is boiled and observed, how the midwife checks for an off smell, how a small amount is given to a chicken and watched. The tense paragraphs here show hands clenched on benches, the way someone closes their mouth to hide a sob. The metallic ring of the kettle as a test is set up. For 500 to 600 characters, the scene holds the reader in a slow countdown. In the end, the illness proved to be a sour batch due to a neglected pail. But the breathless accusation had exposed how thin the thread was that kept Leah safe. Gideon then stood openly in the council room and spoke in a voice that divided itself between tenderness and authority. He said, "I will not let this woman be led away by rumor." Jacob argued, tradition holds weight, and many murmured that mercy could undermine order. A private letter was produced that contained proof of Leah's name and a seal that connected her to a far place where a family had once promised to return. The forged aspect of the letter was uncovered by a scribal habit that Samuel recognized, and which revealed that the note Betsy had brought was contrived. The technicalities of revealing a forgery were explained by Samuel. He pointed to the slant of a certain letter, the pressure point where the pen lifted and the ink pooled, and the way the fold matched a district not theirs. The unmasking of the false evidence was a process of 3 steps: examination, comparison, and testimony, which spanned several hours, each step described with the detail of a legal inquiry. The resolution that followed had to serve both justice and mercy. The woman who had planted the letter was identified as a relative of a man who had long coveted Gideon's role and who wished to secure a marriage alliance through scandal. She was led to apologize publicly and to accept a period of formal apology and labor in service as restitution. The community decreed that an apology would be read from the steps of the meeting house and that she would assist Esther in the midwifery for a season as recompense. The restitution process was formal. It required a signed statement, the witnessing of 2 elders, and a public reading that reasserted the Ordnung while making room for forgiveness. The person who had attempted to manipulate the truth was then shunned for a time. The act both punished and protected the community from further scheming. This act of public reckoning cleared Leah in the eyes of many, but not all. After the council, Gideon took Leah back to the orchard where the air smelled of cut grass and a single lamplight caught in his hand. There, he said, "I did not promise to be a sword, but I promised to be a shield." Leah placed her fingers against her throat to feel the steady pulse. And then she did something the meeting house had not allowed her to do. She spoke a full sentence, her voice thin and certain, and she said, "My name is Leah, and I am tired of hiding." The sound filled the orchard like rain in a dry night. It surprised even the owls. That moment led to a private ceremony of sorts, an informal vow between them that was not marriage in law, but a covenant of protection. The people who had watched from behind curtains saw instead a simple scene of a man wrapping a coat around a woman who had finally spoken, and the sight became an image of grace. The scribe Samuel wrote the event into his ledger as a day of mercy, and the midwife Esther prepared a quilt to commemorate the vow. The epilogue unfolds over 3 moments in time to show the ripple that a single truth can make. 1 month later, the meeting house had shifted its routine slightly. The hymn list included an extra verse of praise for those who listened, and the quilting table added a square to each new blanket that told the story of how mercy saved a neighbor. The apprentice teacher Samuel rearranged his lessons to include a discussion on the dangers of rumor and the skill of listening. Leah now helped in the schoolhouse. She taught the littlest children a simple song, and with her quiet voice, she taught the cadence of truth to those too young to suspect its power. 3 months after the orchard vow, Gideon had petitioned for a modest land allotment, and with it had created a small plot where Leah could plant herbs and mend the old fence. They hosted a communal pie, and the people who had once watched with suspicion came to taste the harvest and found it honest. Hands that had sewed needles through other people's stories began to stitch a communal cover for those in need. The enforcement of ordinance did not vanish, but it softened in practice when elders saw mercy enacted without collapse of order. 6 months on, a child who had been born under the cloud of rumor ran through the yard, and Leah read aloud to a circle of women who knitted and listened, the sound of her voice now ordinary and full like water returning to a stream. She began a small school for girls and boys where quilting lessons were paired with reading, and the midwife Esther sponsored a fund for those without claim to a family name. Her legacy became practical, a ledger entry that named the shift an ordinance for a monthly appeal to aid newcomers, written in Gideon's hand and witnessed by Amos and Jacob. This long epilogue shows how small acts of courage can translate into institutional change, and the language used is domestic but firm, showing that the community both keeps its laws and learns to adapt them. The transformation was not total. There remained those who muttered that tradition, once bent, could not fully return to form. There were nights when Leah waked from dreams and found Gideon gone to the lanes to settle some small dispute, and she pressed her hand against the quilt and felt the old seam. There were whispers that the woman who had lied to bring scandal would return again. Yet the pattern of daily life had altered enough to admit a more humane practice. The meeting house adopted a rule that any evidence would be examined by 2 impartial witnesses, and that a private defender could be appointed in matters of reputation. It was a small legal reform, a procedural safeguard described in Samuel Ledger, and it bore the fingerprints of those who learned that silence could be abused as easily as words. Leah used her voice sometimes in public, and other times she kept it close to her friends, but always she used it to teach that truth could be protected without strangling mercy. If this story moved you and you want more tales of quiet courage in communities where rules bind and mercy frees, please subscribe. Here we tell stories of people who learn to speak when the risk is worth the promise of breath, and we examine the slow work of changing institutions from the inside. Leave a comment starting with "I would" and 1 word from face, courage, flight, so we can feel how your heart would steer a character like Leah. Your answers help shape whether the next tale leans more toward public reckoning or private forgiveness. Join our small community, and you will receive each new story first, and you will find a place to discuss the moral choices these characters face. Now go and imagine the smell of fresh quilts and the sound of a voice that used to be kept safe until it was time to speak. And remember that sometimes what holds a people together is the decision of one person to break their own silence. She had entered the meeting house as rumor and left it as story, able to teach and to heal. The community had altered a little, and the promised man had kept his pledge, not as a monarch, but as a neighbor. The ordinance that followed gave children a chance to learn to read and to ask questions, and in the spaces between law and mercy, a new tradition grew. If this story touched you, leave the single word freedom in the comments, and consider subscribing to hear the next journey of a quiet soul who will not be named by other people's shame. In the end, Leah taught them that power is less when it silences, and stronger when it listens. And her last line as she sewed a final patch into a quilt read like a benediction: "Speak when necessary, and tend the truth like you tend a garden."